You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.
Welcome to the Cricket Podcast, where we're going to be reflecting on England's first tour of Pakistan in 17 years. I'm Jack Hope. I'm joined by Ross Legg. How are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely marvellous, mate. I'm surrounded by boxes and I've got no microphone, so hopefully I'm coming through okay as it's all packed away as a moving house.
You're sounding good to me. And we're joined by a man who was on the ground. It's ESPN Cricinfo's Matt Roller. Matt, the first question we've got for you, we'll get into detail about what your experience as we go through. But the first question is, and it's on everyone's mind, where's the food better, Lahore or Karachi?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me, guys. Mo and Ali got himself in some real trouble for quite accurately, I think, effectively sort of comparing the two Pakistani restaurants and the two team hotels that England stayed in. And he was entirely right that the one in Karachi was way better than the one in Lahore. My experience, I had great food in both. It was actually quite sort of worried going out there as a vegetarian that I would struggle to find anything, but ended up having a lot of good food, a lot of good fish as well. I do eat fish, so particularly in Karachi, they have really good seafood. It's obviously a port. It was really good. I would say Karachi probably shades it, but throughout my time in Pakistan, I was very unwilling to weigh in on the Karachi-Lahore rivalry because it was sort of fiercer than I could have imagined.
That was a really diplomatic answer, and then at the end, you just like, no, Karachi. Ross, messages to the listeners, just 20 seconds if you can.
Yep, we are sponsored by Manscaped. So if you want to shave your balls, go and buy a Manscaped product using code, is it CricketPod? I think the code is. And you get 20% off. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe to this video, and then follow us at the CricketPod on Twitter and Instagram. And then we also got Patreon. Go to Patreon/the CricketPod and get access to all kinds of stuff, including the Discord ahead of the T20 World Cup, which is going to take over our lives.
Yeah, we'll do. We'll talk a little bit more about our plans for that maybe at the end of this show. Well, a lot happened, didn't it, in Pakistan? We've got cricket. We've got England being there for the first time in 17 years. We've got, I think, generally a successful tour. Matt, I'm just going to sort of ask for your general impression. It must be a pretty special trip to be part of, in cricket terms, quite a historic moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of growing up, most of my memories of watching Pakistan play at home was in front of empty stadiums in the UAE, particularly sort of, one man and a dog, if that, watching their test matches in huge stadiums in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So to be part of a sort of experience and witness 7 sold out T20 games, which actually as well, I think that the series, I was, slightly concerned heading out there that it could be quite a one-sided one either way, just with both teams missing players, and it could sort of struggle for narrative. But I think it really sort of seemed to capture the imagination, and obviously helped by staying alive into the final game. To sort of experience that sold out crowds throughout, huge levels of noise, huge levels of love for their players who are sort of, I think it's difficult to imagine the level of celebrity that these guys have as well. It was a pretty special thing to be part of, and I think particularly sort of those first few days of the tour, you realised how big it was. I remember before, I think Joss Butler's first T20 as England captain this summer, there were one guy from Sky, one from the BBC, and maybe 5 written press at the day before for the preview day against India. When Butler turned up and did his press conference on arrival in Karachi, I think there were maybe 25 broadcast cameras, maybe 80 reporters in the room, in like a swanky ballroom in a hotel with 3 chandeliers and all this stuff, and it just completely different scale to anything I've witnessed over here. So to get the opportunity to go out and witness it firsthand was very special, and I think it's a really positive thing, especially after the sort of last minute cancellation last year, that this tour sort of seemed to go so well, and fingers crossed the test series in December likewise.
Yeah, what was your experience, from a personal point of view, being in Pakistan? Did you have a lot of freedom to get out and about and see the country, or were you basically in the same hotels as the players living their life which was quite restricted, as we understand from over here.
Yeah, the players very much had a diet of hotel ground. I think that was interrupted maybe once or twice by a couple of rounds of golf, but there was a huge level of security there. And I think probably, from conversations out there, probably hugely over the top in terms of what's actually required. But I think PCB are so keen to ensure that nothing goes wrong. They sort of understand that they have to, they can't spare any expense basically. So the team were traveling in bulletproof buses. The whole city would basically go into shutdown while the teams went back and forth to the grounds. There was a motorcade, thousands of police, snipers on rooftops, all that sort of thing, which is quite dramatic, and I think visually quite a lot in the first couple of days, in particular for the players. But I suppose it's something you get used to, and also something that a lot of them had experienced before in the PSL. For us as media, we were really lucky in that we were sort of left to our own devices and had a certain level of freedom to roam around. I was sort of quite apprehensive heading out about how much time I might potentially end up spending in hotels, and we were all staying with the team, so I thought it could have been quite a sort of claustrophobic few weeks. Actual lived experience was completely different. Had so much freedom to wander around, felt safe throughout the whole thing. And sort of got a decent grasp, I think, on the two cities. Obviously, they're both massive, so hard to sort of, it's a bit like going to London and saying that you feel like you know the place because you popped into Covent Garden or whatever. But at least you get to do it. We got to do a bit of sightseeing, experience lots of local food, and just see some really cool stuff as well. So like in Karachi, for example, the team hotel was about a 5 or 10 minute walk from the polo ground in the center, or the old polo ground in the center of town. And on a Sunday morning, you have probably 600 or 700 people going down there to play table games. You're literally trying to walk around and you're ducking and weaving because people are smashing balls all over the place. People are bowling really fast. It's just that, it's something that you can't really imagine as, especially sort of English guys of our generation. It's not something you'd ever experience. You're lucky to see one team playing in a park, or a father throwing a ball to his son or daughter. So to sort of see the love and the passion for the game and that sort of thing was incredible. And to have had the opportunities we had to go and see stuff was something I'm really grateful for, because I was sort of fearing it would be completely the opposite, when actually we were really lucky.
Did you play? Did you were you into that fast bowling?
I think honestly the games were so competitive that no one was really offering much of a bat or a bowl. I was actually quite fancying facing a couple, but then I realised that people might decide to dig something short. So
what I heard from that is that the England players, very, very important. Supporting media, expendable. Is that what I took away from that?
No, not at all. We were very well looked after throughout, actually. Yeah, the hospitality was great. PCB couldn't do enough for us. So it was really good.
If I'm perfectly honest, my experience of playing cricket with Pakistanis and then going around the house for tea, etc., hospitality has always been kind of very high up on the list. And actually, there's always been very open and very kind of loving and caring. And so, it's nice to know that is not just something that I've met a few nice people along the way. It's actually that cultural piece. How was being in the stadiums themselves? As you said, they were sellouts, right? And the noise that you hear on the TV, I can imagine, doesn't really do it justice of when you're kind of sitting in the media box at the Oval, for example.
So in Karachi, I think particularly then, there were a few moments that will really stay with me. I think the second game, Baba reaching his 100, that was a proper roar. And then also the fourth game when Harris Ralph was bowling sort of 96 mile an hour reverse in duckers to England's lower order. That was pretty special as well. I think that it was given not out, but the ball that he smashed it, I think it was a hat-trick ball, smashed it to Reece Topley's pad, having just got Dawson and Ollie Stone, I think. That was a pretty incredible noise throughout that sort of 5 or 10 seconds. We were really lucky actually in Karachi as well that we were sat sort of outside. We were offered the chance to sort of go and sit up on the rooftop, which was meant that we had a real feel for the crowd in a way you often don't when you're hidden away behind glass, particularly in the UK. So that was really special. And then Lahore, we were behind glass again, but had an opportunity to get out a little bit during the game, so you had a bit more of a feel for the atmosphere. But I think particularly those those ones at the National Stadium, yeah, that was pretty incredible to witness. I think the only thing I can really compare some of those noises to would be, like a Premier League last minute winner type celebration, that sort of raw. And also the other really interesting thing, I know you guys will be all over the sort of, Pakistan debate about their T20 team and the top order and all this sort of thing. It was really cool to see that sort of play out in real time in a couple of games. So there was, I think, the fourth game when they'd set this platform with the top order, and then you had a strange period near the end of the innings where Masood and Rizwan were really trying to attack but sort of not getting it off the square. The crowd sort of actively celebrating Shah Masood getting out, and then jeering and booing because Kushdil Shah was sent in ahead of Asif Ali. And it was like, it's one of those things where you see people talk about it on Twitter and you realize that people are getting quite worked up about it, but you don't really understand the sort of strength of feeling and the sentiment and the engagement that people have in the game until you're sort of in there and in the heat of it. It's quite hard to imagine that happening over here, like someone celebrating someone who's going a bit too slowly getting out towards the end of an innings.
I was going to ask about that because you could, watching it on TV, it sounded like that was what was happening, and I was going to ask sort of as a general atmosphere question whether that actually was the case. But that's quite remarkable. I don't know off the top of my head of people used to say that Indian fans would celebrate the fall of wicket before Tendulkar batted because then they got to watch Tendulkar bat. But like that is quite, it's definitely a level of engagement in T20 as a format that maybe you don't get in England. And I think there was a game, wasn't there, where India were taking on Australia and Pakistan were taking on England, both at home on the same day. I think both of them won quite good matches, and it really was sort of one of those moments when you're like, oh, the centre of cricket isn't like England or Sydney anymore. It's Asia. Was there, with cricket returning to Pakistan, was there any sense of that on the ground? Like, do people in Pakistan appreciate how that comes across on the TV, or how it was sort of perceived by people like Ross and I watching from afar?
I think so. I think my impression at least is that I think obviously I got a slightly strange impression of it because as obviously sort of touring media, we stick out a little bit, and people sort of immediately know because there's not a huge number of English tourists going to Pakistan, and a lot of the ones that are from British Pakistani background. There's a sort of intrigue as to why you're there almost. So obviously people are very keen immediately to talk to you about cricket. But yeah, my experience was definitely that, you understand how big a deal this sport actually is, and you sort of recognize that while sort of English fans quite often sort of feel as though they're the center of the universe at certain times in the summer, I think you sort of you get a bit of a feel for how big it is over there. I think also just talking about the support of the fans, I think it's quite notable and quite unusual for there to be a sort of partisan a crowd against England in any international game. Because if you think, for example, that tour England went on to the Caribbean in the spring, the two actually, the T20 and the Test tour, both times with a huge number of travelling fans, to the extent that I think in the Barbados Test it was something like 98% British fans at that game. Whereas there was no official Barmy Army tour for this series in Pakistan, and there were a handful of traveling supporters at most. So for there to be a sort of, I remember the moment where that really stuck with me was Luke Wood's first international wicket, where I think he ripped Nawaz's off stump out of the ground. It was met by pin drop silence, other than Luke Wood sort of jumping in the air and shouting, which was quite a strange thing to witness, because wherever you are in the world, pretty much outside of Asia, if England take a wicket, the likelihood is that there will be some kind of travelling support celebrating and cheering. But yeah, it was complete opposite there, which was a pretty cool thing to sort of experience. And yeah, as you say, sort of get a grasp on the fact that cricket is massive. It is like complete different scale as a game outside of the UK.
Absolutely. And you mentioned kind of Luke Wood there. How did the inexperienced England players kind of fit into the overall picture there? Because it was a kind of an England B+ team is how I described it in the last podcast.
Yeah, it was interesting, I suppose, in terms of the dynamics. Obviously, I'm sure it was a bit disappointing for Tom Helm and Jordan Cox not to play, but I think, for example, someone like Ben Duckett was talking about how he found the experience of, knowing he wasn't going to be part of the World Cup for being on the tour, and saying, it was almost one of those where once he got picked in a certain role, he didn't really need anyone to tell him, this is what you're in for. He was like, right, I know I'm basically subbing in for where Ben Stokes is going to bat in the World Cup. I know I'm going to face a lot of spin like I do in domestic cricket, and I'm just going to, sweep and reverse sweep the whole time. And I think, in a sense, it's quite a nice way for someone like that to come back to international cricket, because of the fact that there wasn't the same pressure of, you're competing for a spot in the short term. It was more, show us what you can do over a number of games. And he's probably, for example, someone who's made quite a good case for other formats just by his success there. I know, obviously, it's probably a bit of a stretch to say he's pushed his test case in the short term, but looking ahead to sort of 50 over World Cup next year, I think he's shown himself against, shown that he can play spin, and not just the spin that he faces in domestic cricket in the UK, but playing on very different pitches against people like Shadab Khan and Mohammad Nawaz. So heading into a 50 over World Cup in Asia has probably been quite a good opportunity for him to show what he's capable of.
To zoom out a little bit and talk about the cricket here, we've got some questions about that. It finished 4-3 to England. I thought actually the 7-match bilateral series would be a disaster, and I was proven wrong. It was really a really engaging series. I also said to Ross on the last show that I felt like England were quite a lot better, and that 4-3 maybe flattered Pakistan a little bit. Sometimes when you're not watching a game live, you're watching it from thousands of miles away, you get a slightly different impression of what actually is going on and what the different skill gaps might be, or and so on. Where do you sort of, what was your take on the series as a whole, and which team do you think shaped up best?
Yeah, I think England were the stronger team across the series. I think Pakistan probably didn't really learn a huge amount. They confirmed that their batting is hugely reliant on Mohammad Rizwan and Babar Azam, and it became pretty obvious that Haris Rauf was by far the best seamer that they had available to them in that series, with Shaheen injured. Other than that, I don't think they necessarily learned a huge amount. I think they had some games where they played pretty well, some games where they played pretty dreadfully. I think 5-2 would probably have been a fair scoreline, but I was quite glad for there to have been a decider, even if it was a bit of a damp squib. I think England's played pretty well for the most part. I think even in some of the games they lost, there was generally something that went right. So, for example, when they put up 199 against Pakistan in the second game, where Rizwan and Babar chased it down without losing a wicket, they didn't bowl brilliantly. But with the bat, I mean, they actually had a really good night. So it was one of those where, even though there were some games where they lost, I don't think at any point, other than potentially the fifth game where they went 3-2 down and screwed up 2 lowish chases in a row, I think that was the only point at which you sort of thought maybe this England team isn't quite as good as maybe they thought they were. But I think overall, England worthy winners, and I think got a reasonable amount out of the tour as well. I think particularly, obviously, I'm sure we'll come on to this, but Harry Brook was probably not by any means a nailed-on starter in the World Cup team heading into that series, but it's very hard at this point to see him being left out for the first game in a couple of weeks' time against Afghanistan.
Yeah, it kind of a Kevin Peterson-esque swagger about him in that middle, which I was very much enjoyed.
Yeah, he's like an incredibly clever batter, I think. In terms of, if you sort of see him come across in interviews, he doesn't necessarily seem like he's probably not the most like intellectual bloke, but in terms of cricketing IQ, I think he's right up there. Sort of working out in advance what he thinks a bowler is going to bowl, and then giving himself a couple of options. And do that, and it's a free hit. So I think
people never really understand how difficult it is to do an inside-out lofted cover drive. And that is always his trademark shot. It's like, that's what I'm good at.
Yeah. So when there's especially because of the fact he scoops, there's always against seamers, there's almost always fine leg is almost always back, and that means that he's almost always got one of cover and mid off in the ring, and sometimes both. And that means that when you're as good as he is at playing a lofted inside out extra cover drive, it means that's a very very valuable shot for him in terms of the scoring opportunities it creates. And he looks absolutely unbelievable, doesn't he? And I think, as I say, I find it very difficult seeing and leaving him out here, which has some sort of interesting repercussions, I guess, for the balance of their team and all that sort of thing, and entry points and so on and so forth heading into the World Cup. But I guess we'll see that play out over the next couple of weeks, particularly in that series against Australia in the build up to that. We
may as well go a little bit deeper on that question now. I think I read your piece on Harry Brook on ESPN, which I think you've mentioned the two salient points there about how clever he is and the scoop in particular, but other people should go and read for more detail. How do England put him in the team? Because I think Matt Mott said yesterday, didn't he, that Stokes was going to bat 4 or in the top 4. I've seen two stories on that. How are England actually going to fit all of these players in? Do you know?
So I think obviously some of it is fitness dependent, particularly with Liam Livingstone. I think he's still coming back from his ankle injury. I would be surprised if he played all 3 of the games in the build-up against Australia. And I think he's probably I think he's more likely than not to play in the first game of the World Cup, but I don't think he's nailed on at this point. Just fitness-wise and sort of, not wanting to risk him in the first game if they don't have to. But I think at full strength, England basically have probably 8 nailed-on starters, and then there are a few difficult calls to make. So I think Butler will open with one of Hales and Salt. I think Hales is the favourite in my opinion, but I can see, depending on how the series against Australia plays out, it being one or the other. I think Milan will start at 3, Stokes at 4, Brook 5, Livingstone 6, Moen at 7. Wood and Rashid will be 2 of the sort of frontline bowlers, and then the question is then around the seamers. I think the most likely one is Tockley and Jordan to fill the other 2, but Sam Curran bowled pretty well in Pakistan and would obviously make a long batting lineup even longer. Chris Wokes, much as he hasn't played a huge amount of T20 cricket, obviously very skilled with the new ball. And England may have put a high value on early wickets, rightly so. So there are a few decisions still to be made, but I think that's the sort of rough outline of the team as I see it. I think heading into that tour, there was probably very much still a question mark over the balance and whether they would have the extra batter in Brook or the extra all-rounder in Sam Curran. But as far as I can see, the only way Sam Curran gets in is probably a number 8 at the moment, or if Livingstone is injured, he might start. I think that's the sort of rough outline as to how they'll set up, which, personally, I think is probably a pretty solid side. I don't necessarily agree with every little detail, but I think that's the rough outline as I see it.
Yeah, in a way, that feels quite harsh on Sam Curran, who has been, pretty good over the last few months, thinking back to the beginning of the 100 to now, coming back from that injury as well. I don't know if we've got too much more. I suppose the other question to ask is about Pakistan and what their chances at the World Cup are. Now, one of the things we've not really been able to work out is whether Shaheen is possibly in the frame. I think no is the answer to that, but
or he's got a fractured back, or a ruined hamstring, or whatever. And Dr. Ganguly on India said that Bumrah he's in contention, and then had a stress fracture. So some of the bits we get isn't perfect. So we're wondering what's the verdict, Dr. Roller, on Shaheen Afridi?
Yeah, well, as a trained medical expert, I can categorically say no. I think my impression throughout was that Shaheen is a possible for the World Cup, but I don't know whether that's a 10% possible or an 80% possible. So I think he clearly makes a huge difference. He makes them with Shaheen in there. They suddenly have a very strong bowling attack, and without him, they look significantly more vulnerable. I think in terms of Pakistan generally at the World Cup, I think it's quite hard to say actually, because they're one of those countries that hasn't played almost any cricket in Australia, particularly in T20s, and a lot of their players haven't had much experience in the Big Bash either. So it's quite hard to sort of work out, for example, someone like the top 2, for example, is a good starting point. How will they go on Australian pitches against top quality fast bowlers? They play South Africa in the group stage. It's pretty hard to work out really how they're going to go against Nortje, for example. If he bangs it in short, you can obviously transfer certain things. Bawa looks a bit rushed by Mark Wood in the couple of games that he played, but it's quite it's kind of chalk and cheese when you're saying those skiddy low pitches in Karachi and Lahore versus what they might get down in Australia. I would say that firstly, I would say that my sort of big takeaway from the World Cup last year in Australia, sort of getting hammered by England and then going on to win it by stringing 4 wins together, is that the format lends itself to unpredictability, and I think a number of teams could win this tournament. I might disagree with certain things that certain teams do, but I think it would be silly to sit here and say Pakistan absolutely can't win the World Cup. I mean, if they have a good run of results at some stage, they absolutely could. Personally, I think I would probably have them as only third favourites in the group. I think I would probably have India and South Africa as the 2 teams penciled in for the semi-finals from that group, and I would have Pakistan slightly further down the pecking order, but I don't think there's a huge amount in it either way, and I don't think they'll go into either of those games as huge underdogs by any means. I just think there might be it might be a 55-45 or a 60-40 type call. I think Pakistan are, as over a number of years, they are a flawed side that has managed to get pretty good results throughout a longish period of time, through having a pretty strong bowling attack and having an opening pair that, even if they don't always hit the ceiling, they quite often raise the floor and mean that it's hard to bowl them out really cheaply. I think it's going to be huge. One huge thing is going to be Shadab Khan, who's I think injured his hamstring in the final game, and be interesting to see how sort of serious that is. Whether he plays any part in their tri series they're playing over the next couple of weeks down in New Zealand, because he just gives them such a incredible balance by the fact that he can come in the middle overs and hit, and he's also one of the better leg spin bowlers in the tournament. But yeah, I think Pakistan is sort of a solid side, but I would probably have them as, I don't know, 5th favourites or something like that for the tournament, which sounds a bit harsh now I say it out loud, but yeah, I think they're good but not great.
Fair enough. I think that is basically everything from us. The only question that was left on the list, I think Ross, you put it on here, but I think it might have been as a joke. Ross wanted to know whether anyone fell in the pool like Alex Carey, or whether there was any behind the scenes hotel hijinks that didn't make it out. So, did that happen, or failing that, what was your favourite memory from Pakistan?
I don't think there was any. I don't think anyone fell in the pool. I think the most enjoyable sort of random bit of hotel chat was that, as the touring media, particularly in Karachi, we played quite a lot of table tennis, and at various different points, a couple of Pakistan players got involved. And I think one of my sort of highlights of the trip, and thinking and sort of witnessing something and realizing in the moment how surreal it was playing table tennis against Alim Dar, who doesn't have a backhand, which is quite a strange thing. So I worked out pretty quickly that he didn't have a backhand, but like he had a really quite I don't know, he had a real flourish in his forehand and would also play it to literally every single shot. So I think he ended up beating me, which was quite embarrassing, having been proclaiming my ability as the reigning press back champion. So yeah, I was pretty gutted about the result, but the whole experience was fitted into what was quite a surreal few weeks to be out there and drinking in the series.
Yeah, well, put that into the matchup category. And when you get to Australia, maybe think about that next time. Just be like, right, I'm going to change my approach.
Cool. We'll wrap it up there. You can find Matt over at ESPN Cricinfo. Matt, is there anything you'd like to plug or mention?
No, not at all. Give me a follow on Twitter, and that's where most of my best work ends up.
Cool. Thanks very much. Then we'll see everyone later. Goodbye.
Yeah.